Hey everybody, this 5 Watt Live is brought to you with the support of my good friends at TrueFire. More about my friends there and later on the stream. Today, being a most music from the least gear proponent, I am fascinated by rig history. I don't think there's a single rig rundown that I haven't watched. And the guys at Premier Guitar became friends of mine actually because of me using their clips and asking their permission and all the time, et cetera, et cetera. I have a clip today that from a Guthrie Trapp interview, and I was shocked to see that it was from 9 years ago. And there's parts of that interview that still, as they say, live rent-free in my head. So I'm fascinated by rigs, in the history of rigs, the current situation, both gigging and at-home players. I've had David on this past drag this week talking about, I've had him on in the past talking about bedroom volume, how does speaker choice impact volume or amps, and working at home mostly. But it seemed a logical progression to talk about how you should go about choosing the right amp for everything from your living room to live gigs. David, you may or may not know that David was a very, very active gigging player in his youth, and has some interesting perspectives on this subject, as well as always, it's great to have him with us. He covers for me all the time, bails me out. We can both cite famous rigs from people and why they use them. We want to hear very much from you guys. David had the idea to find out, make you guys out yourselves about who was gigging in the 80s, 90s, noughties, as they say. But I'd actually go so far. I've had people tell me on the channel all the time that they were gigging in the 70s or in the late 60s. And I love it that these guys are still involved in the community, and these guys are still gigging. Some of these guys are still out there playing in like Beatles cover bands and stuff like that, which I think is amazing. So we'll be asking you questions as we go about the size of the rigs that you used at each of those periods in time and kind of where you are now. David, I would say that the biggest hole in our direct knowledge is David, and neither David nor I have gigged recently. So we're not close to the in-ears only kind of world that is getting to be prevalent, even in sort of, as John Cordy would say, even in a function band kind of a setting, as he does on a weekly basis, I think, in England. All right. Okay. So if that's cool with everybody, see the description of the link for the online store for t-shirts, hoodies, and hats. Also, the links for the 5 Watt Friends of 5 Watt on Patreon is there. So if you want to stay closer in touch with me, you can shoot me messages in Patreon. And at the highest level of that, you can actually do monthly phone calls with me. I just set one up with a guy that's a friend of 5 Watt, and we're going to do a call with myself and Zach Childs to all sort of debate the different parts of his pedal board. I'm looking forward to that this Friday. If you've been thinking about starting your own YouTube channel and didn't know where to start, think about grabbing my YouTube Mastery for Musicians course. It's everything I learned, both of my own and from my YouTube mentors like Rick and Rhett and Tim. It's kind of a way of me paying that forward. The 5 Watt World Barber Electronics Overdrive pedals are available on Reverb and directly from David. If you're international, you should go definitely directly to David. The Plus pedal has been getting a lot of noise in Nashville, and I know that it's on Jed Hughes' board out on the road with Vince Gill. All the links are in the description. Remember, if you have a comment or question, put question marks in front of it. Leave a little space and see it there. I'm laughing because I glanced at the chat, and there's Jeff Mackerlane coming in hot with Monty Python. What's all this then? I think that's I don't want to go too deep into it. That's too much of my herbally enhanced college memories, let's put it that way, to go down that road right now. The music in the intro was, and as I said in the chat, was John Cordy from an episode where he had dimed his Fender Pro Reverb at home. He's using a Fryette load box to make that possible. John has a 1965 Pro Reverb. It was the first, I think the serial number they've tracked down, it was the first one built in 65. And it has a sort of difficult to prove provenance back to David Gilmour's guitar tech, and hence to David Gilmour. So it's kind of a cool amp, but it kind of lives in his bedroom because it's big and heavy and it's too loud to gig. He has gigged it once that I can remember on one of his videos. So he can't really use an amp that size, but he did a video, and as you probably all noted, it sounded amazing in that room through the load box. But he mostly gigs at Deluxe. And if he's not gigging at Deluxe, he's usually on a Fractal FM9 with in-ears. I think that's his thing. We have to get David, we'll have to get John on to talk gigging gear sometime. So David and I are to discuss part of why That Deluxe is sort of a Goldilocks wattage, and I'm sure that'll come up as we go along. Let's get David in here and get started. Oh, I did remember how to do this. He does this quiet intro, so it makes me think the power is not on. Are you good?
I believe it's on. And
you okay? Hello. That's right. That's right. Do the Mick Taylor thing. So let's do some of this chronologically. David, either of us probably could do this, but you were there in an amp tech kind of capacity, working in guitar stores when I certainly wasn't. Why big amplifiers? Why were there mammoth stacks? Why big amplifiers?
Well, big music, big stages, probably not quite as much PA, certainly not as much quality monitoring as, has come about. Even a fairly small band can afford to have some sort of a monitoring system now that's a lot better than what a lot of people had. I guess we're talking 70s and 80s, but the music was loud. Just in general, the concert venues were so loud that stage volume supported it. It felt good to have the power behind you. If you were going to play rock music, you needed to be visceral. So there was all that. And you needed to look cool, a bunch of Marshall stacks and some SVTs,
Yeah.
You can't lose.
We're going to have you go through your Danzig experience, I'm sure. If we go back a decade before that, I'll just do the 5-watt world short history moment and remind everybody that, for example, a Vox AC-15 became a Vox AC-30 because Hank Marvin and the Shadows, and then afterwards, shortly thereafterwards, the Beatles were simply being screamed down by their crowds, by audiences. And the other thing I'll remember people is if you have experience, if you haven't had a chance to sit behind like a 58 or a 59 Bassman, those old Tweed amps, you'll notice that all of the labels point to the back and there's 4 inputs. And the assumption was that everybody was plugging into one of those amps that would be set out at the front of the stage, and everything from the microphones to the guitar to whatever they were going to run that needed to be amplified was all running through that single amp. And getting more and more clean power was sort of the early 60s version of let's get bigger and bigger and bigger, so that by the time we got into the 70s and stacks and 4x12 Marshall cabs, etc., that was the era that clearly looms the largest in all the punny ways that applies.
So I have echo.
Oh, you have echo. Are they saying we have
Everyone
echo?
says it in the comment section that I have
okay.
echo, which is kind of appropriate for the sound of big amplifiers. It's like I'm in an auditorium. So
let me see what I can do here.
This is by design.
We had this before, but then I clicked.
You put headphones on.
I did. I lived with headphones last time. That works.
Last week you did headphones. Proximity of mic to your speakers could also be part of it.
Always, yeah. Keith is on speakers. Yeah, that's the thing. That's the thing. I'll turn you down and I'll get my headphones. Entertain them. I'll be right back.
Entertain them. Where were we?
David was reminding,
and I'm not prepared with a joke.
David was reminding me that, I apologize for the echo, people. David was reminding me that on the very first time I had him on as a guest, for a while I was getting a lot of deliveries, and they would always come at like 4:30, right in the middle of the stream. They would show up. So I literally left a room and left David alone on here. So here we go. There we go. Volume down.
Some people are wishing they could have the echo.
I guess this is life as it is these days. At least they're really nice ones. There.
All right, we should be good now, right?
Everybody?
Everybody tell us that we're good. I'm counting on you.
Unplug the delay pedal. I just got a really nice delay pedal, so that's another episode.
We haven't gotten
Anybody?
any feedback yet. Not on mine.
All
right, well, let's keep doing it.
Cases.
They'll tell us.
There we
know
go.
It fixed it.
Okay. All good. Carol Shields. Carol, come on,
right.
Bring the jokes. Okay, so let's do that again. So I guess we did it twice already. So chronologically, the big amp world was the 70s into the 80s. When David,
oh, yeah.
So talk about your experience. When were you playing out? What was your playing out experience? Because it went from sort of local clubs to pretty big stages. So why don't you run us through your chronology and tell everybody what you were using at each of those phases, and then we might as well just start right off with what your system, your very scientific system for knowing what size amp you were going to need. So set the context for everybody.
Okay, so it started in 1979 with a Fender Champ, and I was playing the high school talent show. I think we played American Band in Freebird, and the amp burned up. The amp shorted its power tube with me trying to keep up with the other guys during rehearsals. So I got my first big amp. My parents took me to Bill's Music House in Catonsville, Maryland, and we bought a PV Classic, an early one with kind of the silver knobs on it. And that was my 50-watt amp, and that worked great for that. And all we had was the school PA system, which was just literally the public address part of it, where it's just for the voice and there's no band in it. And so you needed big sound for that. And that's, as surprising as it might be, going from the high school talent show all the way through a good bit of like early gigging, the sound coming off the stage was important, especially if you had small gigs. Even today, if all you have is PA on a stick and it's just for vocals, then your amp has to be the right wattage for the gig, the right number of speakers and size of speakers for the gig. The more you have sound reinforcement, or the more you have sound limits as far as where you're playing, that starts to bring in a lot of your different choices that you have. But the whole way through the 80s, I would say, was still a very much reliant on fairly large amplifiers. None of us played in-ears. I think some big bands, like really big bands, may have had some sort of in-ear systems at that time that you'd hear about. And then even in the 90s, I remember working with bands, rock bands. We're just talking like, because most of my gigging was between 1979 and right up to the very first day of 1998. That's when I stopped gigging live, mainly because I didn't want my ears to ring any worse than they already did. And my hearing was still good, and I didn't want to mess that up. So there's another reason to play a small amp. You don't want to blow your ears up. So all the way through, though, there were gigs where I would need to, as I've told you before, make my adjustments as far as what amp I was bringing to the gig based on the drummer that I was playing with. So I thought of drummers in watts. And so a drummer who plays from the wrists and maybe plays like a 7A drum stick, which is a pretty light stick, you could get away with a Deluxe Reverb if you needed a true clean sound, like squeaky clean. If you didn't need to be perfectly clean, then a Princeton would work, but I didn't have that too often. If the drummer plays from his forearms, then I tended to bump it up to more like 35 to 40, 50 watts if I needed a clean sound. And I would think of that drummer as the 45 to 50 watt drummer. And then if the guy plays this kind of stuff where he lifts his arms above his head, if I need to play clean, I needed a 100-watt twin, or I needed some kind of if I wasn't playing really clean, I could get away with a 50-watt amp for sure. And I usually needed, like, for the lightest gigs, a single 12. Anything in the middle, I needed either 2 10s, 4 10s, 2 12s, but usually didn't need 2 12s. I usually played 10s in the middle for some reason. I think a lot of people choose the middle wattages for the most part, but stages have gotten smaller where we are now, and they continue to get smaller, and big rock clubs tended to go away, and people moved towards lighter rigs to carry, lighter guitars, lighter amplifiers. So that had a big impact on those changes, and the ability to monitor and have better sound reinforcement systems, again, that don't weigh a whole lot. You can bring a lot more, neodymium powered speakers with you on the gig now that used to weigh a lot. You can have a lot more power available to you, and the Class D amplifiers help to have a lot more wattage on the PA on a stick, and people started putting more in the PA even in small gigs.
You told me the other day that one of your favorite gigging amps was a Super Reverb, and I was noting that you can buy a used Super Reverb pretty cheap because people don't want to schlep them around, and it's way too much wattage in a lot of cases.
They're a good condition 60s one. It's pretty easy to spend $2,000. So even the late 60s, drip edge or something like that. I had a drip edge up until 10 years ago because I still like supers that much.
Yep.
The drip edge I have now is right next to me. It's a Bandmaster TFL 5005D.
Go ahead.
And 40 watts. And Eric Johnson has two of those.
He finally came around. EJ finally came around to using your amp.
Yeah, I was going to say, I had this before he did. And then I have, of course, well, let's go this way.
There you go.
The amp behind me is a 50-watt Barber Echelon. And, that was designed in the early 2000s, like, say, 2001 through 2000. I think we started doing majority of our sales in 2004. And at that time, a 50-watt head and a 212 was still a pretty popular combo. Heads and cabs were still something you saw a lot of people using, especially if they had a guitar room and their gig was at home. Mm-hmm. But it seemed like right around the fall of the banks, 2007 to 2008, a lot of interest moved towards combos. Less interest was in boutique amplifiers after that. Dealers didn't want to carry them as much. They got stuck with a lot of inventory around the banking fall. And so that changed the way people looked at amplifiers. Basically, what's in your dealer's shop?
Right.
And what do you want to spend your money on?
Right.
So when houses were no longer ATMs, people started thinking a little bit differently and buying smaller amps. At that time, like I'll go one more with a popular gigging amp when you have people who are still not trying to go small. Probably the most popular backline amp right now seems to be the Fender Blues Deluxe is what it's called, I think. And it's not necessarily a great amp. It sounds Fender-ish. Not easy to work on, but it can get reasonably loud, on the gig.
Yeah.
And you see them a lot.
Yeah, I think that's true. Adam Levy, who's a friend of mine, has in their rider, and he does a lot of international work, has in their rider a Deluxe Reverb, and he said he almost always gets that. There's almost always a backline company's got a Deluxe Reverb in one state of repair or another. He also has had a Origin Effects Brown 61 a Brown Deluxe emulation pedal that he runs right into the front of a Deluxe Reverb, a 65 reissue. And
that's a big part of where we are now. For a lot of people, their gigging amplifier, so to speak, is some sort of a modeling device or a pedal that is a modeling device or an emulation device of some sort. And that's become, even for me, that's the way I record most often now, because it doesn't require an isolation room. And IRs have gotten very good, speaker IRs. And it allows you to work both live with a consistent sound and a fairly consistent performance, where, a tube amp, as much as I still like them the best, if you end up on a stage that's on the same circuit as the big walk-in freezer at the nightclub, well, you might only have 95 volts to power your amp from, or 100 volts or something like that. I've seen them remarkably low, and your amp may not sound that good at that voltage, although some people do. Like, I guess Eddie Van Halen used to variac his down, but inconsistent is the main thing, whereas modeling works off of regulated power. Matter of fact, it needs to be very tightly regulated. And so it does tend to sound the same, and it gives you consistency and keeps your stage quiet. You can use your in-ears for everything. So you have a lot of these kind of technology things that change the way we perform live and the amp choices that we have live. It's funny, I think, that we still choose the same amps in essence. Even though you might not carry your Deluxe Reverb to the gig, you bring a Universal Audio Dream 65 pedal to the gig. So you still got your familiar part, your Deluxe Reverb, but now you've got in-ears in, and the sound man has no sound coming off the stage. Maybe you might have a little wedge for somebody who doesn't want to play with their in-ears, but it's a lot more controllable, but still the same amp in essence as far as what we want from it. And to that point, look at what Fender ended up doing. Fender ended up making the Tone Master series of modeling amps.
Yep.
And instead of making them modern amps, they made them repros in a modern technology way of a very super reverb. I believe they have one for that. Twin reverb. All these things have been recreated using digital modeling, but they still function, and your workflow is still like the older amps. So I still think the workflow is something that's extremely appealing, especially now that we're pedal platforming. Everything's built around being able to work from your pedal board to create all of what we used to think of as amps features. Does it have an overdrive channel or a drive channel? Does it have a graphic EQ built in? Does it have an effects loop? Does it have reverb? Does it have tremolo?
Yeah.
Those things don't really need to be built into amps anymore. It's one place that amp builders and amp manufacturers tend to be behind right now. People are doing all that on their pedal board. I thought that Fender would do great to be able to make a tube amp that was just volume, treble, middle, bass, no reverb, no channel switching or anything like that. Something that was easier to service, had less things to go wrong, and really gave players what they want, because they just need a playback system at best on stage now, because so much is able to be done on the pedal board.
Right. Let's go back to give people more context. And after your PV Classic 30 or Ecclesi Classic 50, what was the?
This is well before they did those kind of tweed looking amps.
Oh, okay. What was the progression of amps for you? Like, what did you play after that, or did you add amps for bigger gigs? Did you have multiple amps at one time? I have a clip of Guthrie Trapp talking about that I wanted to run, where he talks about like which amp he decides to. Actually, let me go ahead and run that, and then we'll come back. I want you to walk people through, because right up to your Danzig experience, because I think people, I'm always laughing really hard about that. So let me run this.
Yeah. So, it's nice to have the good thing about Fenders is you can get that tone for any size room you play. So if I'm playing a really small room, I can get the tone I like with a Princeton. If it's a little bigger place, I can use the Deluxe, Vibrolux. If it's outdoors or something, use a Super. I got a Pro Reverb in there, or a Twin or something like that. I don't own a Twin at the moment because they are so loud and heavy, but for the studio, I've got a lot of amps and cabinets out there on the other side of that wall, and I usually always take a Princeton or a Deluxe, or the Vibrolux, because I can throw it in my trunk if I don't have cartage. I can take my small pedal board and a couple, 3 guitars, and I'm pretty much in there,
Yeah, and it's pretty rare to be playing with a band that a Deluxe won't cut.
Right, yeah.
Like if you're loud enough where a Deluxe isn't going to cut, then you're really loud.
Yeah, you're going to be pretty loud. And these days, man, unless you're in a really big rock and roll band, everybody in town's using small amps.
Yeah.
That's just kind of the new thing.
So that was 9 years ago. Clicked the wrong screen. That was 9 years ago. I was really surprised it was. And this sounds a little bit like a Fender ad, but his point is basically he's got 3 amps that kind of do his thing. I did say to David before we started that the reality is he's using a Vibrolux. Now that he has a trio gig 9 years later, he's got a trio gig. He's been gigging with Tom Bukovac and doing some other kinds of things. I noticed he's out there with his Vibrolux. I think everybody is running a little bit more volume in those guitar-based gigs, that they're doing in Nashville or up at the bitter end in New York. I know people. Well, if Jeff was still in the chat, he could tell me what those guys used in New York. But let's go back.
The sound of tens too. If he has more of an appreciation for tens right now in his career, then Vibrolux would be the next amp I would choose. I tend to think of a Vibrolux in a lot of ways as being a lot like a Deluxe, similar, close enough size, close enough circuit that I would mainly choose that for the sound of the tens and maybe just a little bit more power. It's funny though, because the Deluxe is the one that no matter what area you look at, no matter where you're playing, at home or on a big stage, that amp tends to go everywhere. That's kind of a can't lose amplifier unless you're like Dimebag Darrell. That's just that's something where you need something very heavy, heavy sounding. That is. But it seems like with what's available today as far as the rooms that you play size-wise and the types of PAs that we have, that makes it a lot easier to blend something in. Most people, when they hear the word super, even though it's a great sounding amp and the sound of tens is a different thing, they don't really want to carry that much weight. And we probably should, we're leaning heavily towards players of all grown up music. Things where there's a little bit more angst involved might not be so leaning towards Fender. Mm-hmm. Maybe a bassman's kind of cool. I think Kurt Cobain may have used those, but the side of this that we're missing is, what do you do if you're a rock player or an alternative player? some alternative players still want to play a JC 120. That was a popular new wave amplifier, and it's still, for kind of a almost direct kind of sound with a great chorus built into it. If you want your chorus to be built into your amp, that's still there. And they have smaller versions of that now. Boss Katana is an amplifier that is in almost everybody's house that plays guitar these days. It's really changed a lot. The Line 6 smaller amplifiers starts with a C. I'm not remembering the name of the small Line 6 amp.
Catalyst.
That's it.
Catalyst. Yeah. Right over my shoulder there.
Guys who gig with those, there are enough watts that you can do that. And then there's obviously people who still want to have a 412 or a 212 behind them. And whether it be a rectifier or an Ubershaw or a Fish, those amps are still popular enough with the right crowd because they're playing them for the sound, and they still have the back to carry the amp with them. When your back fails, eventually you go get a modeler that will do those sounds, whether it's the Line 6 HX Stomp or the Kemper. What's the other big one besides the Kemper?
Fractal.
Yeah, Fractal. So you see a lot of guys who play really heavy metal amps that have picked up on the Fractal and also the Kemper and things like that. So there's
Cortex.
A really wide range of what people use. There's a pretty wide range of what people own. We'll go to your friend Rick Beato. How many amps are behind him when you watch his video? I don't know whether he fools with modeling or not, but he certainly has all the amps in reality. He doesn't need to, I'll say the word a second time.
Rick always says it's faster for him to put a microphone on a real amp that he owns in the back wall, or frankly, there's way more amps in the other room. It's funny because I think the only two really small amps that Rick owns, he either asked me which one he should buy. When he bought his Princeton, I told him which one to buy. And then he actually bought an AC-10 for me at one point, which he loved, and he used it on live streams and things. I'm going to come back to that, but I don't want to lose the going to have you do your context. But of course now it's half past, so let me do my TrueFire ad, and then we'll come back and actually get you to tell us the amp progression that you had for your own live playing.
You can try.
Okay. I always promote lessons over new gear, so TrueFire has been the perfect partner for 5 Watt World. I'm interested in all kinds of music, and by taking advantage of TrueFire's All Access Pass, I can always find something to scratch the itch I have for learning more about guitar. As a viewer of 5 Watt World, you get an exclusive 50% discount on the All Access Pass, or you can take a 35% discount on any of the courses in the catalog by using the dedicated links in the video description. I really enjoy TrueFire, and I'll bet you will too. Sign up using the link in the description to support 5 Watt World and get some great lessons at the same time. Practice smart and play hard with TrueFire. I'd like to thank TrueFire for their support in making this section of the video. Sounds like I was going to start talking again there. I had to quiet myself. All right, so after your Classic 50, then what amps did you have?
Well, it's funny. Those PV amps weren't exactly the most reliable amps that I had. And so the Classic had problems. And this is also how I end up with my connection of the electronics knowledge I had gained as a kid just by tinkering with electronics hobbies when I was very young. And my amps started, they had problems. So I fixed the Champ. I still have the Champ, but it made me learn about shorted power tubes. The Classic burned up. Well, it didn't burn up, actually. Now I think about it. The reverb stopped working. And at that time in my life, I needed reverb. And so I learned how to fix reverbs on those kind of amplifiers. But then I went to like a PV Renown, probably another Renown. Eventually I got a Marshall 4-input amplifier. Actually, I think it's possible. I had a Laney first. I had a Laney AOR, I think is what they called it, designed by PJ Marks, if I remember correctly, an early amp designer. And that amp had a lot more gain than Marshall's. The first time I plugged into a Marshall, my thoughts were, this is it? Where's all of the distortion? I turned it up to a level that I could play it, and nothing was happening. I couldn't imagine playing any of the rock stuff I was playing. The Laney did it. The Laney had extra, preamp stages in it, extra preamp tubes. And so I went from there, and then I kind of realized how to work a Marshall. And I traded the Laney. Again, I bought a 412 cabinet when I bought that Laney, and I kept that 412 all the way through the 90s. So I bought that in like 82, 83. And that was just the speaker cabinet for me for a long time. I loaded it with 2 EVs because I wanted it to be heavier. and a couple of high-powered Celestion speakers that Mesa sold at the time. And I got this is crazy, I got a Marshall Super Trem 100 in a trade. And it really didn't give up the goods. And then I kept hearing Van Halen talk about this plexiglass amp that he had. And I pictured a clear amplifier, like a plexiglass Dan Armstrong guitar that were plexiglass, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
So I thought I would see that one day. I always pictured like, wow, I've never seen this thing. Meanwhile, I ended up getting rid of the Super Trem because I was on my way to trying to figure out what one of these plexiglass things was. It was a plexi Super Trem. I didn't know that that's what he was talking about. I had the amp I thought I wanted. So I ended up getting rid of that. I got a Sundown for a short period of time. Again, 100-watt amp. And I went through the 80s mainly playing 50 and 100-watt Marshalls. I eventually learned the whole Marshall game by the mid-80s. At that point, I was repairing them, and so it helped me to learn a lot about how they worked and how you needed to run them and how much volume you really needed to get the best out of them. And after that, it was just Marshalls, Fenders, Mesas. I would get a Mesa like Mark II-C and modify that, or a 3C and modify that to make it a little bit less fizzy. And I was at that point just doing so much with amp mods that by probably around 90, I was mostly building amps that I would buy that were defective in a sense. They were broken. People would sell me a Marshall or a Fender for $50, and then I'd use the chassis and the transformers and the cab and just build my own amp inside of that before I figured out how to build my own like chassis and cabinets and everything else. So my story doesn't go the way most people's would. Most people don't end up building their own amp or modifying their amps. But, you know, Marshalls and Fenders were kind of the end game for me. Once I really got into those, other than making my own amplifiers, I started to be able to find all the different sounds I wanted, and I started to be able to cover the different gigs pretty easily. Yeah, I knew what I needed to bring.
Briefly, what was your time? How does the Danzig happen? How does that happen? Like, and what was your role?
So it was a kind of a strange thing. John goes by John Christ. He was John Von Christ at first when he was in Danzig. Was a friend of ours. My best friend had been his best friend when they were younger, playing in bands. And John got the gig. And John had done some teching for us once in a while in the band that I was playing in. So yeah, John Christ was my tech for like 10 minutes at a couple gigs. And so when he got the gig, my friend recommended to him that he called me up about teching for them. And at the time, I'd been working with Paul Smith. Paul was getting ready to make an amplifier. And so I would drive down to Annapolis and work with Paul Smith, listening to different Marshall mods.
Paul Reed Smith.
What's that?
Paul Reed Smith.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And at that time, he was modifying Marshalls mainly. He had to be the guy who did it because he had the name. And then I would help him sell those, and he would use that to finance these different projects that he was working on, namely what became his first amplifier, the harmonic percolator or whatever that was called. I can't remember. Harmonic generator, the solid state amp, the first one. It was really pretty. It had lots of colors and things like that, but it didn't end up selling well enough. So eventually he moved on to a different thing. But so that experience made them feel good enough, John feel confident that I could go out and be his tech on the road. And so I was only out with them for about a month before I couldn't be a tech for Danzig anymore, because it was just like you would imagine. It was, the stories are true. It wasn't terribly well organized, and you didn't really get any sleep, and it was really loud. John had 3 stacks, two Marshall 412s for each stack, and a head. So 3 full stacks. Erie Vaughn, the bass player, had 3 SVTs with the 8x10 cabinets, but we only used 1 SVT. Another one was always kept ready to go in case something happened and you needed it, because tube amps on the road can be a problem. And then the Marshall was just 50-watt Marshalls. They were JCM 800s. I modified them to have a little bit less kind of a fizzy sound than they did at that time, and a little bit more pure tone that John had gotten on the Danzig album they had just done with Rick Rubin. And he used one of those and a Boss EQ pedal, and that was the rig. And it was wide open for the most part. I mean, the amp was doing everything that it could as far as wattage. So how loud could you play? in 1990, you still could play very loud. The sound man that went with us did not ever complain about John's level, and I don't think Glenn would have been too happy about a sound man that told his guitar player to please play quietly, because they're Danzig, that doesn't work.
Right.
And so coming back from there actually was when I really started to put a lot more regular time into being a technician along with being a player. That was, I think a lot of that was because locally a lot of people liked the Misfits, Sam Hain, Danzig, and they were like, oh, I can get the tech from, Danzig to fix my gear, even though I was only out for a month.
Mm-hmm. That's good too. Yeah. Somebody's got a question. Pedro Garcia wants to know, let me see if I can pull this up over here. And this takes us back where I wanted to go, which is what is a small, quote unquote, small amp? He says, how many dBs would you say is loud enough for stage volume? And of course, that has a lot to do with how big is the stage, how big is the room, how many people are in the room, all of that sort of thing. We did a great, and the drummer, everybody's trying to keep up with whatever drummer you've got there.
A drummer with 2B drumsticks instead of like a 7A drumstick, which is a light stick. Yeah. It's going to be loud. And their cymbals are going to be really loud. You have to make it somewhere in that ballpark if you want to hear yourself and you don't have an ear.
And Pedro is saying, is 100 dB good enough to get over the drums? Depends on the drums.
It's ballpark. It really depends on the drums. But, there was a band that used to play some really big clubs on the East Coast I think they were called Dred Zeppelin. And they had a singer who dressed like Elvis Presley and sang Elvis Presley lyrics over Led Zeppelin music. And the guitar players played pig nose amplifiers mic'd up. And this was in rooms that held 3,000 people. And they had pig noses. And this was in, I think, the late 80s, early 90s. So, those pig nose amps aren't really producing much over probably 85 decibels tops. Yeah. So you can get away with a lot less. It depends on the PA you have with you. If you don't have PA, you're going to need an amp that produces 100 decibels to get over a drummer who plays hard.
Yeah. So I had in the original show notes that I sent to David, what is a small amp? And everybody always, actually JL Trum, John said in the comments really early, he's like, the best amp is a 5-watt amp. And I was like, despite the name of the channel, so rarely can 5 watts work. Although I do have an offbeat story about seeing a band locally where a guy was running a silver panel Vibrachamp behind his pedal steel of all things, basically treating it like a distortion unit. But it was mic'd. It sounded amazing. But, everybody points at the Eric Clapton, Layla, the Derek and the Dominoes record. Both those guys were playing champs. The story goes on top of the piano with a packing blanket thrown over it. Everybody likes to talk about how Jimmy Page played a Supro, but that Supro was modded to use 6L6s. So basically it was a 40-watt amp. I had to chuckle recently in the last couple of years. Robin Ford did a record. I think it was the Purple House record where he said that he went in and the Dumble just didn't work. All of a sudden, after all these years, he just wasn't feeling it. And he goes, so we did that whole record with small amps. I think there was a Vibralux there. Well, okay, we're back at 40 watts, And
there's a difference between a gig and a recording. Everything you just mentioned was how people recorded. You can get away with 1 watt in a recording. It doesn't matter as long as you're getting the sound that you want. But live, if you need to be clean and you have a drummer at all, you probably can't use a champ. And you probably can't use an 8-inch speaker. Even a Princeton, even though you hear Mike Campbell talk about that, Mike Campbell doesn't really play like perfectly clean. I don't think he wants to play that way. It doesn't fit Tom Petty's group. But you'd have to play that amp pretty quietly to get that, and it wouldn't be enough to really hear yourself well with a drummer. You either have to put it right next to your head, which would work. I've seen people who used to just put the amp, very close to their head and use a small amp. But small amps, even a single 10, just doesn't move enough air next to a drum set to feel like, that size-wise that you're in the ballpark. The drummer will seem, if they have acoustic drums, like they're taking up a good bit more space. And is a lot more visceral, and you can feel it a lot more than what a single 10-inch speaker is going to do. Even a single 12. I never was a fan of like those Mesa 100-watt amps that would have a single EV12 in them. They always sounded still kind of boxy, and they could get loud, but it was more like hurt you kind of loud, not feel good kind of loud. I understand they needed the whole concept was to take a Princeton, to the furthest place you could. It's like taking a VW Bug and putting a giant engine in it, or something like that. But in reality, you need to move a little bit of air more than I need watts, to be honest with you. I could probably get away with a 30-watt amp and a couple of 12s, or a couple or 3 or 4 10s.
Yeah.
More so than one 12 and a 100-watt amp.
Yeah.
I prefer to have the air move.
I've had a number of people who have talked about, way back when I did the Princeton episode, I basically said, if you can't work a Princeton for the kind of music that I like to play at this point, your drummer's too loud. And I took a lot of heat in the comments. But basically I was saying kind of an Americana kind of a thing. And in that still, I was assuming a lot of PA. And really to have even stage volume for like me to hear it, I probably would add a second speaker cabinet. So I'd have a pair of, and maybe I'd have a 12 in a Princeton already. So that's how you get the Princeton to sort of start to bridge into Deluxe territory. But really, if you're carrying that much stuff, you might as well just take the Deluxe. And that's the reason, as I said earlier, the Deluxe is sort of such a sweet spot for so many people playing these days. 20 watts, 22 watts in Deluxe's case is something that you see a lot these days. I was telling David that I remember, it's probably a long time ago now, but when the Marshall Studio Series amps came out, the SV20s or were those, I read that Peter Stroud was going to use a pair of those on the road with Sheryl Crow. Well, those are probably as big a stages you're going to ever see. And he was using one run clean and one run crunch that then he overdrove with his pedals. He's got a big pedal board. You're hitting those kinds of things with a light speed or something like that, or a plus, it's going to get pretty crunchy pretty fast. But again, that was the stage volume. But 20 watts is still really loud on stage, can be really loud on stage. So.
Yeah, the environment has a big impact. Obviously, we talked about sensitivity of speakers before, and you can make a 20-watt amp pretty loud if you're using a speaker that has high sensitivity. Conversely, you can have a pretty loud amp now and buy that Celestion speaker that's meant to really make things a lot quieter, has a low sensitivity. So it doesn't have to be about wattage, but it really, when it comes down to it, workflow is number one. So your example of Rick Beato, we'll come back to that. He likes those amps because the workflow is real simple. There's an off-on switch. There's a standby switch. There's a volume, there's a treble, there's a middle, there's a bass, there's a presence. There's a pre-gain and a master volume. It's really easy to work. It's instant results. You know what's going to happen. You're not menu diving in the slightest. You don't have any of those things happening. So if you need that, and that's your, if you say anything beyond that and I turn into a Luddite, I don't want to menu dive, then you have to look at those kind of amps. You tend to have to look at classic amps, or if you're going to play something that uses more modern technology, you're back to things like Fender's Tone Master Series, because they have the workflow of a vintage amp, but they give you a lighter package and something that uses, I guess, the modern technology. I think the main advantage of a Tone Master is most likely the weight. And I can't really even say that I would consider them more reliable because they just haven't been around long enough. There's so many old Tweed amps that are still in service, and the person who owns them would never play anything else. That how do you say, something like a Tone Master is going to be more reliable than a tube amp? Other than you might be able to drop it further, but without breaking glass.
I'm not sure you could drop it further because the boards are what they are. They're kind of standard boards in there. Lyle from Psionic Audio has done a lot of good sort of reviews of these, and he basically is like, well, it depends on how long you want your amp to run. And certainly as a tech, I don't know if the parts are going to continue to be available, et cetera, et cetera. There's no way around. You lift a Tone Master Deluxe out of the box the first time, literally when the box came to the house. I don't have one here now, but when it came to the house, I thought that they'd forgotten to put the amp in the box.
And you had a Princeton Tone Master, right?
I have one. Here. It's in the other room. I think it weighs 17 pounds.
So if you had to keep one, the Princeton that you got, that's tube, or the Tone Master, and you had to say that's the one I'd take away if I couldn't have both, which one would you take?
Well, I'm not gigging at all now. So
which one would you take?
I would keep I have two Princetons at the house right now. I have a Mojotone Princeton reverb kit that I got, those guys assembled for me and sent to me, that I'm still sorting that out. And then I have a Fender Princeton hand-wired, the 64 hand-wired here right now. And at the price that those are, there's no other way to put this, at the $2,900 that they are, I don't want to like that amp as much as I do, but it's really hard to argue with that. To tell you the truth, yeah, I when people ask me what they should have at home, my answer is if you don't have a lot of space, absolutely a Princeton. I usually quote Jeff and say, always get a Princeton for at home. Takes pedals really well. The 10-inch speaker is really good at lower volumes. It's really great. If you have the space, because of the way it moves air and stuff, at the same volume, frankly, I think a Deluxe is a more satisfying experience.
That's what I would take.
And I would say that that's
amp to cover everything with the exception of metal gigs, I would take a Deluxe. And strangely enough, when I made the sound clip for your Les Paul studio video, I ended up using a Dream 65, so a Deluxe Reverb setting, but used it with a high gain bus pedal and put together a pretty convincing heavy rock sound that I typically would have said, oh, in order to play something like that, I'd have to have at least a 212, with a almost closed back or a closed back and some kind of a head. I would have thought I needed that at one time. Yeah. Even as a technician at one time, I would have thought that I needed that. So things that have happened. Technology's gotten better. Overdrive pedals are more convincing. Reverb pedals are vastly more convincing than they were just 20 years ago. Yeah. And I think back to the Holy Grail that at one time was the Holy Grail for people. I'm sure some people still play it, but in comparison to what's available now, like a Delverb from Universal Audio, I don't need the reverb that's built into an amp because of that. Flint from Strymon, I don't need the reverb built into an amp because of that. I also don't need the trem built into the amp because of that. Right. So there's a lot that changed, and even guys that were pretty, I'm seriously a retro grouch when it comes down to a lot of this stuff. But eventually the technology overwhelms you, and you realize I don't have to play that way. I don't have to rely on those specific things. But then of all things, the Deluxe Reverb, which has built-in reverb and built-in trem, is if I had to pick one amp to get everything done with, and that's what I have for testing every day. Yeah. And the other reason I use it for testing every day is because so many other people have it, that I know I have to make everything work through that format.
Which is one of the reasons that pedals don't sound great with it, because a lot of pedal builders design around that because of that assumption. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and one of the points I was going to point out was when it came to getting kind of martially sounds from things, I point everybody back towards the Beano on a Budget video that we did. David was involved with the original Beano video, and then the Beano on a Budget video. Jeff McErlane had his brothers, at the time he owned a 64 Princeton, original 64 Princeton, and he put David's version 4 direct drive in front of it. And one of the sounds he was using for that video as a kind of like A-B kind of thing was an original Plexi Super Lead that Jeff owns. And then he dials up this Princeton with this pedal, and he was like, I hate to say it, but it was like one of the best sounds we got, period, for the video. It's just the best Marshall sound was a 64 Princeton with this David pedal in front of it. It sounds like a big ad, but the fact is, it's what Jeff said to me at the time. And it also, like I said, Jeff he's been teaching for a long, long time, and he's always been a big proponent of a Princeton as your at-home amp. And I said, even if, frankly, one of the other choices, somebody said to me recently that they absolutely loved their 65 reissue Princeton, and they were kind of wanted to flirt with a wet-dry setup. I'm like, okay, now get a Tone Master. You want one that's super light, and you could take it to a rehearsal or a coffee shop gig, and you're going to play a little electric guitar along with an acoustic player or something. That's something I would take. I have one of those, and I would, with a 12-inch speaker, and I would probably take that to that kind of a gig, just because of the convenience. And they're not as cheap as they should be, but as a second amp, a pair of Princetons is a great thing, is a great sound too.
I would try a Tone Master as a live amp. I wouldn't be afraid to at least give it a shot. And for smaller rooms, like if I was playing coffee houses and things where you just don't need much, I wouldn't be afraid to look at something like a Katana, or the Catalyst, or the Fender GTX. I don't know which one I would like the best. I don't know whether in the end I would feel comfortable using those on gigs, but I would certainly check them out because they become such a regular part of people's gigs. They're light enough. Yeah. I have a Katana. I don't think it sounds as good as a Deluxe Reverb. I wouldn't choose it instead of one. There's still a little bit of that immediacy that you tend to get with solid state amps, but that immediacy isn't always kind of like mandatory shackles. Of modeling or something like that, because the Dream 65 does a pretty good job. I'd be interested to see what a company like Universal Audio could do with making a small amp with like a Dream 65 as the front end of it. They've never been an amplifier company, but it would be nice to see their technology, which I think has less of that overly immediate sound that some modeling does, especially when you're trying to play clean. I don't want it to come off like a mixture between a solid state amp and a tube amp. When I have a modeling pedal and I'm modeling a tube clean sound, I still want it to sound like a tube clean sound. I want that degree of kind of like, as I always call it, like soft but detailed top end. There's plenty there happening with high-end energy, but none of it hurts.
Yeah.
And you can sit it in a mix without anybody feeling overwhelmed. You can actually feel like you can be more present in the mix without it feeling harsh.
Yeah.
And so I don't know whether those kind of amps will always do that. That's why you always fall back to a tube amp in a live situation, because you know you can reliably get those types of performances from it.
Yeah. We haven't been able to go to the crowd, and here we are. It's like almost 10 of. So
let's do it.
Let's do some of this. There was a quick question here. Somebody Daryl Monk wanted to know what we thought of a 4x10 DeVille. Just heavier. So I think those are cool. You see DeVilles with the 212s out on the road. Landau has a special model of a DeVille that he was doing for a while.
My opinion on that would be buy it because you don't have money for something nicer that has the same basic features, the amount of wattage, the number of speakers. If you can afford to go to something a little bit nicer than that, I would rather have a Super than a 410 DeVille for sure. I don't like the way that, from a repairman, I don't like the way it's laid out. I don't like the repairability of it. I don't like the channel switching. I don't think the distortion circuit that's in it is worth the extra effort for the second channel. And the complexity that it adds, and the lack of reliability you get from their channel switching circuit. I would take all of those Blues Deluxe amplifiers, Blues DeVilles, and
Blues
I would
Junior,
take out
everything. Yep.
I would take out the overdrive circuit and just make it the best it could be, like where Fender started. I think that's what they're the best at. And I don't, again, their channel switching circuit seems to cause more problems with reliability than what it's worth, in my experience, in my opinion, from what I've seen.
Yeah.
You know,
and when you say you take it all out, what you meant is if you were redesigning the amp, your experience would have been go this direction. You're not saying that you're
Fender tomorrow.
There we go. That's when you own Fender, when you're right.
And I love Fender stuff, but I can also look at what they're doing from an objective standpoint and just say, this is not an added bonus. I bet it sells amps. I bet built-in reverbs and built-in overdrive channels sell amplifiers and get them off the music showroom floor.
Or it could be that it used to.
That's not how people use them.
Yeah. Pedro Garcia shares what I would go on. Everybody go ahead and tell us what you're gigging currently. Pedro's he's got a 6505 with 212s, vintage 30s, pretty bright sensitivity, 100 dB, 20 watts with a master volume at a 50%. I get 100 dB. That's why I wanted to get the point of view. So,
are we going to do what are you gigging now? What were you gigging in the 90s? What were you gigging? Okay.
Yep. Well, I want to hear from people I don't think we have time to do all the different decades. So let's just go to, I want to hear from people what they're gigging now. How big is your band and what are you gigging? So I'm curious to see the range of stuff that we're going to see. Victor's reminding us that Mike Campbell, it was in my notes, Victor, I just didn't have time to squeeze it in. I even had a picture here of Mike Campbell uses a Tweed Deluxe with a Princeton. He used for years a Princeton non-reverb, and then he's now gone to a Princeton reverb. The interesting thing to me was that a lot of those early Petty records are very voxy. He doesn't seem to have trouble at all running those two amps to get that kind of really bright, voxy sound with the way he plays, from his hands, in other words. But he also, for years, used a Princeton reverb as his stage monitor. He basically had, if you watch, he's got a Princeton reverb off to stage right, blowing right back at him. Really close, kind of down to his feet, but tilted way up.
Are the responses coming in?
I'm actually going back while people load those in. Victor's saying he's got a Germino SL35. That's a nice sweet pot. I love 6v6s, trying to do the job of 40 or 50 watts. It's a great sound. Rob's right to the point here. Says back. He just got back. Does everyone here have a guitar flunky to carry the amp? I think the vast majority of people do not have a guitar flunky to carry the amp.
PA systems, guitar rigs, and bass rigs have all gotten lighter. Guitars and basses have gotten lighter. So it's obviously a direction that people want to go. It's everything that's lighter sells easier, sells faster. Even though there's a movement against it here and there, overall, overwhelmingly, it's about light gear.
Here's Brandon Wynn says, I play through a 1996 Fender Hot Rod Deluxe. Seems like a 112 is all I need. That was actually the amp that I gigged. I had the first year when they were, I think probably 96 were made in the US. They went US and then Mexico and overseas on the Hot Rod series amps. The 96 was all I ever needed, but it was a straight ahead jazz gig too.
Yeah, and it's from 1996, so the speakers got 30 years of breaking in on it, which really helps those amps. The speakers they come with are pretty stiff sounding when you first get them, so I bet that one sounds better than a new one.
Rob's throwing out the standard drummer joke. Rob, I actually heard this joke recited at a all acoustic jam the other night. Everybody knows the punchline to this? Homeless? Yes, everybody knows it, right? Here we go. Cody Palmer says, 5-piece country band with electric guitar and pedal steel. I love pedal steel. 15-watt harmonic trem Milkman or a Benson 5-watt Nathan Jr. Both are 30 pounds or less. A 5-watt Nathan Jr. mic'd. So, Cody, can you hear yourself well from the amp on stage, or are you on in-ears at that point?
It's pretty common for pedal steel players to pick rather large, powerful amps, in my experience. So it's interesting to see both the one you talked about earlier, using a smaller amp, and this, not, 100 watts was not uncommon for me to see when pedal steel players called me up and they were looking for things. A lot of them buy our Linden EQ and use that as a pedal steel pedal just for the sound of the Linden EQ.
Yeah, it was funny because actually it was a situation where Roman, my wife, had taken me out for my birthday as a special treat to see a local band that I'd never seen before. And they had a pedal steel player. I love pedal steel. So I looked across the stage, across the room, and I could see there was a silver face amp there. Immediately, it was small, and I assumed it was a Princeton. And I walked over, and I looked down, and I said, oh my God, I can't believe that's a 5-watt amp. And when I said 5-watt amp, all the guys in the band turned to me. They're like, "You're that 5-watt girl guy," because of the voice. They're like, "We recognize your voice."
5-watt police.
Exactly. I'm like, I can't believe you got a 5-watt amp. It's like it's on cue. And he sounded amazing. He sounded absolutely. And actually, it was sort of an edge of breakup sound. And it was a small. Well, I don't know. I bet you that club holds 50, 60 people. And people are eating. So a little kind of chatty, and they were up over it. It was great.
You have people talking about using Blues Juniors. So Blues Juniors and Blues Deluxes were pretty common small amps that actually made it to gigs.
Yep.
Although going back to the 90s, I remember seeing those. And one of the other guitar players that played in Paul Reed Smith's band, I remember him playing 2 Blues Juniors together.
2?
Blues Juniors. Yeah, he used 2 of them. I don't even think they were in stereo. I think it was just the amount of speakers and the amount of wattage that he wanted total. So
like I said, I could see using a tube Princeton with a Princeton Tone Master right next to it and a wet dry, or even just dual mono. That'd be great. Brett, who's always here, he's in a PRS HDRX 20-watt and a gain G. What's a gain G, Brett? Steve Brown's got an Albion TCT 35-watt combo at 12 watts. He's got it. I guess he's got a switch. Nice.
Or maybe it's just 12 watts.
Yeah, maybe. Richard Clark says 4-piece. I play mostly rhythm. Steve Morse, Engel 20.12 inch Hughes and Kettner Tubemeister cab with a vintage 30. Nice.
That's cool.
I think this is true for most of the people that are probably here. He says that tube amp and pedal boards are for writing and rehearsals only, and the gigging, 10 to 15 gigs at 200 to 500 people, is a humble Line 6 Pod Go. There you go.
Isn't that something? Yeah.
Yeah.
And
very simple.
The Line 6 equipment can do it. I mean, I've had pods. I do like my HX Stomp better than those. Just a little bit more flexible, a little bit more power. You can tell that they had more under the hood. But I got a lot of mileage out of a couple pods that I had for recording, for quick sessions where people didn't have time to mic.
Yeah. Bart Chapman says that he's reminding us that the 2-channel Fender amps, I assume he means the Hot Rods later ones, were kind of crappy, except for the Rivera era where he thought the 2 channels were good. That was a very brief moment in Fender history. And of course, Brett comes in with the big one, a gain changer, a gain G. He's so familiar with this gain changer that he's casual. He's got a nickname for it. I love it.
And I've been interested in hearing one of those PRS Hendrix amps, so that's a pretty neat rig that he's got there. I noticed somebody named Callius is playing a Silver Jubilee 50-watt head and a 212 cabinet. I played the exact same rig. Marshall had a Silver Jubilee 50-watt amp in a small box,
Yeah.
And it would sit on top of a smaller 212, like kind of half stacky thing that they had.
Yeah.
And I played that for a while in a group in the late 80s.
Nice.
I loved it. It was great.
Yeah. In a 4-piece band, Mesa 22. Yeah. So a 22 watt Mesa. I'm sure I played those back when they came out. There's plenty of punch.
Yeah.
It uses a load box. Let's
Blues
see what else we
Jr.
got
and a
here.
Marshall Origin 20. I could go with that. I love the Origin 20.
I think you must be deep. You're deeper in the feed than I am.
Oh. Yeah, I read the back of the book first.
Scott from Baltimore says that he had friends swapped out the 410s with a single 15. Chris Welton, who's a friend of mine through the channel from California, does a ton of gigging in wineries and stuff, a lot of outdoor stuff. He came across a twin in a pawn shop. It didn't need a ton of work, but it needed some work. The panel was actually in pretty good shape. I think he paid $350 for it. And took it and had the baffle cut out of it and runs it with a single 12. He still wheels the thing in and out of the gigs because it's still a twin, but he said it's been great. And basically he's using it as a really just big, clean platform.
With a Super, you've got an output transformer that's really made for, around 2 ohms. And so going to a 15-inch speaker, I'm sure he probably either replaced the output transformer or else he's just living a little dangerously with that. You can do it and get into the territory of like a Vibra Verb 15-inch speaker type of sound, but the output transformer shouldn't be mismatched more than 100%. So you can get away with a 4 ohm speaker or a 2 ohm load usually, but I wouldn't go as far as I don't know of too many 4 ohm 15-inch speakers. So I'm going to guess the person who you listed earlier showed probably changed the output transformer too, I would guess.
Here we go. Oh, Mr. Dooley, Keith, I know, has one of those Ibanez Tube Screamer 15 watt amps with a built-in tube screamer and a 1x12 cab. They're really cute little things, and they come in 5 watt world white. They're perfect.
I've always been curious about those because it is a tube amp, and they go for no money at all on Guitar Center used site. And a built-in tube screamer, I always wondered whether it was like Stevie Ray Vaughan already done, just like a Fender-ish, because I understand it's a Fender style tube amp.
Yeah. Oh, here we go. Jeff Rock ROQ says he gave an AC30 for years, and now it's a Sir Ombre. Boy, those Sir Ombres are, I just looked at them again. I used to have one when I did the Brown Amps episode. They are just the right size. And David's whole idea of having a single sort of, single normal channel out of a Deluxe in a cabinet, boy, that would be the size I would recommend. 1 12-inch speaker, put it in that, be sweet.
I'd like to have an Ombre. I'd love to
there we go.
Those.
We should all have one of those.
Every time I see one and think about the types of sounds it's produced, I always think to myself, I should get one.
We should get one. We should all get one.
Yeah.
Can't beat the Sir amps are totally bulletproof. If you want to see one of the rare glowing reviews by Lyle, go watch the Sir Ombre review. He even goes on about the traces on the circuit board. There we go. Rob Nemowitz says, Chuck Berry told me, don't you boys buy no Marshall amps. That's pretty funny. All right. I'm surprised nobody basically chimed in with in-ears, that folks are on in-ears. So, here we go. Brianna Sari says, Fender Super Reverb, pre-CBS, blackface with an MXR Distortion Plus, sounds like tone and Hendrix got on All Along the Watchtower. Distortion Plus, classic.
It is.
There you go. Well, we didn't get through a lot of this, but we did talk about what size and how big. We have a lot of things. What would you still choose to run a big amp? Well, there's a lot of, one of the questions here was why would you still choose to run a big amp? And David and I were talking about this before, and frankly, it's a good way to sum up. One of the reasons to run a big amp because it says rock and roll. I always chuckle when, Mick and Dan talk about how they've, the amps today are a high watt with an HEM, right? No, WEM, a WEM cabinet, and a Marshall, and a 50 watt Marshall with a 4x12. And I'm like, but it looks rock and roll.
A Super Reverb or a Marshall 50-watt head on a 212 or a 412 cabinet, you can play any gig. You can turn it down still. And as long as you have a pedal board that allows you to use that amp, I mean, the most use I got from an amp, especially in the 90s, was probably a Super Reverb. The Super was an amp I could just take to any gig. I'd bring the Deluxes also when I knew that the room was small and that the drummer was really, able to kind of play down to the size of the room. But anywhere else where I didn't know the situation, especially if I didn't know how many people were going to show up, and we were doing PA on a stick, and a lot of guys still are PA on a stick. It's just the vocals, and that means you have to provide the rest. So I'd rather have a Super and have to play it a little quieter because, we don't fill the room, than not have a Super and you got, 300 people packed in a room that's only, supposed by fire marshal, supposed to have 200. And you got people right up against the stage, and, a Super will cover that. I'd be bumming if I had a Princeton on that gig.
Yeah. Victor Beebe's asking if Hendrix started using dual Showman. I remember reading that he used Fender amps to record. I don't think he ever had Fender amps on stage. A dual Showman was a 70-watt amp at a time when 70 watts was a ton of power, clean power. People like the Stones used them at that time. Although it's widely inaccurately reported that they were bassmen because they were these piggyback showmen.
It's basically a twin in a head form.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So, all right. Well, David, thank you so much for being here. I love the stories. You always make me laugh. I'd never heard in the time we've known each other that you used a Champ as your 5-watt entry level, first gig kind of experience. I love that. Absolutely love that.
I bought it from a kid at school in high school, my first or second year there, who was running away from home. It didn't have a speaker in it at the time. And so he sold it to me for $25 so he could get some running away from home money. I still have the amp.
What's more rock and roll than that?
What is more rock and roll than that?
What is more rock and roll than that? All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and have David, Mr. Cordy, I should say, play that 3-minute intro outro again because it's just too sweet for living. And I want to thank everybody for being here. Remember to check out the TrueFire in the description. By using that link, you're telling TrueFire that you got there to them from 5-Watt World and continue to love me. Thanks for everybody for being here. Until next time, I want to thank everybody for being a part of the 5-Watt World. Love everything in the chat, and we will see you again in a couple of weeks. Take care.
Thank you.